Hey there, everyone. Today I'd like to talk about William Burroughs' very short novel, Ghost of Chance. Written in 1991, just 6 years before his death, this is a really fascinating work of ecology and science fiction. It takes place in Madagascar, and it concerns the extinction of the lemurs. And it really shows Burroughs' empathetic response towards other animals. Burroughs was famous for the love of his 6 cats. He famously said that he didn't really want love from other people, per se, when asked if he wanted it by Allen Ginsberg. And I think that there's something really beautiful about this work because it's a commentary on the usual things that Burroughs is concerned with: power, addiction, institutions such as religion. There's a very interesting illness here that makes people believe that they are a messianic figure like Christ. And there's some interesting things that he has to say there. So I'd just like to go through some of the highlights of this book and just give my thoughts. There's something much more mature about this work compared to Burroughs' other works. Now, it still has the very extreme subject matter of something like Naked Lunch or The Wild Boys or Nova Express, but it also has a much more nuanced way of, for example, providing descriptions. It's rather erudite. There's our main character, whose name is Mission, Captain Mission. And just on the first page, it opens up very beautifully. Silence descended like a shroud that would crumble to dust when he moved. Now a cat's paw of a wind frisked across the bay and up through the ferns and leaves, bringing to his face a breath of panic. Little ghost paws rippled up his spine, stirring the hairs at the nape of his neck, where the death center flares briefly when a mortal dies. Captain Mission did not fear panic, the sudden, intolerable knowing that everything is alive. He was himself an emissary of panic, of the knowledge that man fears above all else, the truth of his origin. It's so close, just wipe away the words and look. And we can see some of the continuous themes of Burroughs here, where he's trying to find some sort of spiritual foundation for our existence in the crumbling modern milieu where institutions are being revolted against. Burroughs is infamous for his kind of anarchistic rhetoric, and he says that we should wipe away the words and look. This goes along with Burroughs' notion that language is a virus, that words spread and infect. And we can see that playing in the narrative here, where the lemur population is being killed by colonizers who will go to the natives and convince the natives that the colonizers are genociding the lemurs, which creates this artificial antagonism between the natives and the colonizers. And there's a really interesting thing where he says their way of thinking and feeling, referring to the lemurs, is basically different from ours, not oriented toward time and sequence and causality. They find these concepts repugnant and difficult to understand. And Burroughs really wants to go the posthumanist route here and say that things like rationality or reason or this innate capacity to seek truth that a lot of classical thinkers claimed was kind of the birthright of humans, Burroughs wants to reject these categorically and say that there are other forms of life that are much less malignant than humans, because not only does he want to say that the word is a virus, but that human beings are essentially a kind of legionary virus that creates a malignant time pocket, as he puts it. And there's a really empathetic way that he wants to talk about the lemurs as having some sort of superiority. He says, one might think that a species that leaves no fossil record is gone forever. But big picture, the history of life on Earth is there for anyone to read. Mountain land masses and jungles glide past, some slowing, some accelerating, vast rivers of land on the move or stagnating in wide deltas, whirlpools of land like saws splitting off islands, a great fissure, the land masses rubbing against each other, then splitting, flying apart faster and faster. slowing down to the great red island with its deserts and rainforests, scrub mountains and lakes, its unique animals and plants, and the absence of predators or venomous reptiles. A vast sanctuary for the lemurs and for the delicate spirits that breathe through them, the glint in the jeweled eyes of a tree frog. When attached to Africa, Madagascar was the ultimate landmass, sticking out like a disorderly tumor cut by a rift of future contours, this long rift like a vast indentation, like the cleft that divides the human body. The rift was a mile across in places, and in others narrowed to a few hundred feet. It was an area of explosive change and contrast, swept by violent electrical storms, incredibly fertile in places, entirely barren in others. The people of the cleft, formulated by chaos and accelerated time, flashed through 160 million years to the split. Which side are you on? Too late to change now. Separated by a curtain of fire, like a vast festive ship launched with fireworks, the great red island moved majestically out to sea, leaving a gaping wound in the earth's side, bleeding lava and spurting nauseous gases. It has lain moored in enchanted calm for 160 million years. Time is a human affliction, not a human invention, but a prison. So what is the meaning of 160 million years without time? And what does time mean to foraging lemurs? No predators here, not much to fear. They have opposing thumbs but do not fashion tools. They have no need for tools. They're untouched by the evil that flows in and fills Homo sap as he picks up a weapon. Now he has the advantage. A terrible gloating feeling comes from knowing you've got it. Beauty is always doomed. The evil and armed draw near. Homo sap with his weapons, his time, his insatiable greed and ignorance so hideous it can never see its own face. Man was born in time. He lives and dies in time. Wherever he goes, he takes time with him and imposes time. So this ordering framework of time, one of the quintessential ways of kind of organizing rational structures. You think about Foucault in Discipline and Punish, talking about the way that the timetable was used to regiment modern life, things like factory life and school life, to code the way that subjects interact with their society. Burroughs is really seeing this as something that we impose, something that came about contingently in the history of life here on Earth. And Africa here is where humans came from. All of our migratory patterns can be traced back to our earliest ancestors who lived in Africa. And as such, we have Africa and Madagascar as two kind of masses with a cleft in between them. And this cleft is some sort of discontinuity in history in which these two split off from one another. And Madagascar, an ultimate landmass sticking out like a disorderly tumor cut off by a rift of future contours. There's a sense in which the future cuts into the past and the present like a malignancy, and it kind of pulls things. It has an inertia that begs, for example, there to become the people of the cleft, these people who have to live on the knife's edge. Really reminds me of Nietzsche talking in Thus Spoke Zarathustra about man as a bridge and not a goal. That we live on a bridge stretched between the void and eternity. And that our job is not to try to, in Deleuze and Guattari's language, absolutely deterritorialize to one end or the other, but rather to try to find this in between, to be content with this nice little pocket that we have, and to not try to go beyond the bounds of nature. I think there's certainly a respect for nature that Burroughs sees here. He speaks of the might-have-beens who had one chance in a billion and lost. These are those who didn't make it, those who are the outcasts. And Burroughs always has a sense of empathy for these kind of people. He writes, "Observe the observer observed." It's There's kind of a meta-observation going on there, where we're observing our own dissolution of our ability to observe through our cancerous relationship to the environment. He writes in a footnote, and it's interesting that there are footnotes in here, in addition to these little artworks that are kind of every page, every half page, lots of empty space here and blank pages, much more experimental in its form. But in one of the footnotes, he says, "When we see the planet as an organism, it's obvious who the enemies of the planet are. Their name is Legion. They dominate and populate the planet. The deceived and the deceivers who are themselves deceived. Did Homo sap think other animals were there just for him to eat? Apparently. Bulldozers are destroying the rainforests, the cowering lemurs and flying foxes, the singing Claus's gibbons, which produce the most beautiful and variegated music of any land animal, and the gliding Kulogo lemurs, which are helpless on the ground. All going to make way for more and more devalued human stock, with less and less wild spark, the priceless ingredient, energy into matter, a vast mudslide of soulless sludge." I just love the viscerality with which Burroughs writes. I think you can hear, especially through my accentuating, the extent to which he's relying on the sound of language, on onomatopoeia and on alliteration and things like this. But I think it's very important that instead of saying Homo sapiens, he always says Homo sap, and both of them with capital letters, because it kind of reminds me of the stultifying viscosity of sap that comes out of a tree. That we too are emanations from nature, just as the sap is an emanation from nature. Except we are going beyond our natural limits, creating this chaos that we can see in the artwork here. And we're trying to navigate it, but we don't actually know how to do that because we're constantly going beyond our limits, creating this mass of devalued human stock. I think Burroughs recognizes that our sense of value is really changing. And there's something very interesting that happens where a drug is being taken, and this drug are little yellow-green crystals, and they're eaten. And at one point, and this mirrors something that actually happened in Burroughs' life, where he accidentally cuts off part of his finger, or intentionally, we're not really sure. But Mission cuts part of his finger. He writes, "The blood that drips out is not red, but a pale yellow-green that gives off a reek of ammoniacal corruption, like rotten urine, the reek of man's sojourn on earth. Where the blood has fallen on the rough wood, it eats in like acid, delineating a malignant simian face etched in hatred, evil, and despair." And I think this really is the crux of Burroughs here, because he talks about this ugly spirit. And in his life, he thought that he was basically possessed by this ugly spirit, that he was constantly pulled between these two nodes, which was his bourgeois upbringing and his really radical kind of liberté-focused personality. And there was several discontinuities that happened in his life that caused him to really reject the former and embrace the latter, and try to define himself as a liberated individual. And this comes with it a risk of how far one is willing to go. And I think Burroughs recognized that these radical gestures always have the possibility of leading to the proliferation of hatred, evil, and despair. And this is something that he doesn't really like about humans. He writes, "A man came to me with a sick monkey in his arms and said, 'Heal my monkey. I cannot heal animals. They have no soul. They have grace and beauty and innocence. What are the people you heal but animals? Animals without grace, ugly animals, deformed and deceased by the hate that has caused their sickness.' He cuddled his sick monkey and turned away. Then he looked back and said, 'Go heal your lepers and your stinking beggars. Heal until you have nothing left to heal with.'" So, right, we have this bifurcation between humans and animals, where in actuality humans are animals, and all the way back to like Aristotle, you have this talk of, well, we're rational animals, so we're different. But I think Burroughs is trying to say, are we really that rational? Look at the Cold War. Look at the Holocaust. Look at all of these different things that show our willingness, such as deforestation and colonization, to have a very irrational relationship with that which we most depend on. And this notion of dependency, of course, goes back to Burroughs' understanding of addiction. Here's this very interesting kind of discontinuity that he speaks of happening at Christ's birth. He says, mariners sailing close to the coast of Tuscany heard a great voice speaking with the absolute certainty of words that will never again be heard. The great god Pan is dead. The date was December 25th, year 0 AD. And now there's this notion of these magic men in Morocco who eat their excrement to distinguish themselves from other humans. And he says that Christ held power through the ancient corruption of a different blood. And what is this corruption? Well, it's the blood that we just spoke of. That blood that inspires hatred, evil, and despair, that tries to transcendentalize humans above their imminent conditions. Burroughs states, miracles have to be paid for in life, in beauty, in youth, innocence, joy, and hope, and the ephemeral moments, the magical moments. And Burroughs really sees the history of human society as one of gradual rationalization, of paying for modern life at the expense of life, of beauty, of our youth and innocence, of our ability to be free. Burroughs is constantly creating all-male societies, which goes back to some of his high school education in the Los Alamos all-boys school. And you can see this in, for example, The Wild Boys, where he's creating these male-only societies that are dominated by a sense of tarrying with the landscape, of living in harmony with nature. And he says that Christ seemed to always have this malignant relationship where he was trying to establish a monopoly so no more miracles can ever occur. So, right, you have this notion of in institutionalized religion, miracles can happen, but only under certain institutionalized settings, only when certain figures are doing it under certain conditions which are permitted. And that notion of permission goes back to, for example, Deleuze in Postscript on Control Societies, where he talks about nowadays it's about being permitted to occupy a space, not having a space delimited, but being able to be permitted to occupy a space. He says, so Christ set out to destroy the raw material of miracles, souls, spirit, jun, prana, the force that animates any living creature, spontaneous, unpredictable, and alive. And what is panic? The realization that everything is alive. And I think there's always a little bit of kind of pseudoscience latent within Burroughs, right? This notion that everything is alive. Sometimes Burroughs treats this like it's really the case. I think he really understood, and I'll put this quote on the screen because I think it's really interesting, that irony and satire and parody was very central to just the way that he lived his life. He writes, any competent magic man can heal, sometimes, can't win them all, and cast out devils, particularly if he installed them in the first place. That reminds me of Nietzsche and the Antichrist, talking about this idea that institutionalized religion relies upon the existence of sin. There can be no salvation without a state of original sin, which was installed in the first place. Thus, Burroughs writes, it was Christ's mission to demonstrate that these things could be done only once by one man or by some accredited representative. His mission was a lie. Christ set up a miracle monopoly and a monopoly on the medium of wonder. Christ called himself the Son of Man. I have said that Christ was the mold of a man, but this is not accurate. Rather, he derived from the mold of man and was the son of the mold. All species derive from molds. There are cat molds, deer molds, snake molds, centipede molds, primate molds. When the mold is destroyed or dies out, the species is extinct. The unforgivable knowledge The Creator cannot create anymore, if he ever could. He can only manipulate the creations of his mortal servants. It is slowly dawning on him, as familiar objects emerge in the dawn's light, that he is being ridden off by central control. And this is something that really fascinated Burroughs, is this idea that systems can have so much momentum and inertia that they take on a life of their own that supersedes the ability for any one person, even God, to be able to control it. There's a really interesting spoken word song that I will link to in the description, where Burroughs talks about the idea of a one God universe, where it is irrevocably thermodynamic, and it goes nowhere because it's already everywhere. And God goes nowhere because he's already everywhere. We have this sort of solipsistic implosion that occurs where a system's dynamics start to fight against itself, very similar to Pynchon in Gravity's Rainbow, talking about the way that the human spirit reaches this height where, just like the V2 rocket in its parabola, it must now come back down and destroy us. Just as the rationalist scientific consciousness helped us make advancements in medicine and things like this, it also comes to create the V2 rocket and the nuclear bomb and Zyklon B, all sorts of things that go nowhere other than to proliferate violence against ourselves. And Burroughs really feels this sense of the gathering refuse of violence coming back to bite us. It's almost schizophrenic, where he writes, hearing voices? He can feel doom gathering like a thick yellow fog, and feels the fear as his mission crumbles like shattered wood. He begins to doubt that anyone has ever sent him, that he had any mission or purpose beyond the dictations of a disordered brain. This is interesting. This is the person who has basically been taught through the virus that they are a Christ-like figure. Now they're starting to doubt their own Christ-likeness, kind of like Christ saying, "Father, why hast thou forsaken me?" on the cross. Was there any father who was sending him, speaking in his mind with a different voice? He has seen madmen shouting messages through the streets, bitten by dogs, stoned by children. Is he not just another lunatic clinging desperately to some absolute certainty when his truth is dust in the wind? The honorary agent of a planet that flickered out light years ago? Christ must have realized on the cross that he'd been set up. Without the crucifixion, without the whole deal, it's flat as last night's beer. So his ultimate mission was, by means of a potent symbol, to induce countless millions of human beings to accept a crippling lie. In fact, every man has the potential to heal and to influence the weather. And the rationalists who reject his teachings are the most influential in perpetuating the lie. Between believers and non-believers, there is only a razor's edge. On both sides of the razor, the abyss of willful ignorance. None so blind as he who will not look. And I think that's interesting. It sort of creates a one-eyed approach. This is very similar to the Cyclops episode in James Joyce's Ulysses, where through this rationalization of institutions, we narrow our gaze, and by doing so, we fail to see the potential that's bred within us, and not by any particular consciousness, but something that we possess and have the ability to effectuate, provided that we're cognizant of nature. And thus I think this is just a really interesting way to think about ecological consciousness. And he takes this Christ-like message to a radical love kind of hippie state, but embellishes it with the classic Burroughsian extremity. He says, let love squirt out like a fire hose of molasses. Give him a kiss of life. Stick your tongue down his throat and taste what he has been eating, and bless his digestion. Ooze down into his intestines and help him along with his food. Let him know that you revere his rectum as part of an ineffable whole. Make him know that you stand in naked awe of his genitals as part of the master plan, life in all its rich variety. Do not falter. Let your love enter it unto him and penetrate him with the divine lubricant. Makes KY and lanolin feel like sandpaper. It's the most mucilaginous, the slimiest, ooziest lubricant ever was or shall be. Amen. It's known as the greasy ghost. We'll love you all over and inside out. But there is folks who say the deadly lovers is nothing but vile, rotten vampires need a stake drove up the ass before they love us all down to a thick, toothsome soup and slurp us all up. The master plan, they call it. And I think here we can see really Burroughs kind of coming into conflict with himself. This master plan of radical love, of radical eroticism, really begging us to encounter the other, but at what cost? And I think that's a question that Burroughs never really answers because there's no succinct answer, no final answer. He writes, "The streets of lost chance. Man knows he has one chance in a million to make the connection that will animate the creature he carries in his body. If he doesn't make it, the little creature will die inside him. The pressure makes him utterly ruthless. Anything to protect the child. He can lie, pretend, kill without a second's qualm, for he is the bearer, the guardian of the one child in a million. There were, of course, species that became extinct before man, but Homo sap added a twist. He has killed to eat, but he has also killed for pleasure, to be sure. Moreover, he has killed for the sheer ugliness of the thing inside him, the ugly spirit who found a worthy vessel in Homo sap, the ugly animal." And this kind of postmodern virology that really defines Burroughs harkens me back to one of my favorite quotes of his, where he says, "Every man has inside himself a parasitic being who is acting not at all to his advantage." And you could think of that in two ways. When he says not at all to his advantage, it could be as in not entirely to one's advantage, as it is always partially working against oneself, or a parasitic being who is acting not in any manner whatsoever to his advantage, a fundamental foe within human consciousness itself. And I think that's something we can see here. This ugly spirit seems to be almost the opposite of an élan vital in a sense. It's a sort of destructive and negative thing, kind of like Kafka talking about the axe in the frozen sea, right? It's some sort of terrible discontinuity that happens. And this plays out very problematically in politics, and this is kind of the key message of Ghost of Chance. Man sold his soul for time, language, tools, weapons, and dominance. And to make sure he doesn't get out of line, these invaders keep an occupying garrison in his non-dominant brain hemisphere. How else to explain anything as biologically disadvantageous as a weak hand? They gave with one hand and took back with the other, 50-50. What could be fairer than that? Almost anything. And here he's really trying to ask, what makes humans special? He says, "So it seems likely that the distinguishing factors, language and the weak hand, are related. It seems unlikely, after all, that language was designed solely to convey information. A rift is built into the human organism, the rift or cleft between the two hemispheres, so any attempt at synthesis must remain unrealizable in human terms. I draw a parallel between this rift separating the two sides of the human body and the rift that divided Madagascar from the mainland of Africa. One side of the rift drifted into enchanted, timeless innocence. The other moved inexorably toward language, time, tool use, weapon use, war, exploitation, and slavery. It would seem that merging the two is not viable, and one is tempted to say, as Brian Geisen did, rub out the word." And this, of course, connects to the cut-up technique and a lot of his radical formal experimentation with language. He mentions that today we are inching towards a complete control state with zero tolerance for dissent on any level here in America. And he sees this as the side of the equation that Africa took. That is, the place of our earliest human common ancestors, right? And Madagascar kind of becomes this asterisk, this discontinuity, this interzone of sorts, similar to that in Naked Lunch. So I think that Burroughs is really asking us to really dig deep into the recesses of what it means to be a human, really think about what is this ghost, this ugly spirit that is within us that makes us do such terrible things. That being said, that is it for this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. It was moderately interesting. You can check out any of my other stuff that I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, and I'd really appreciate it. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.